Okay, so picture this. You have a full oxygen cylinder can handle more than 2,000 psi. That's 2,000 pounds per square inch trying to get out. So here's a question that's worth sitting with. Why can't you just hook that cylinder straight up to a nasal cannula? And by the end of this video, you'll be able to know exactly why, and you'll understand two pieces of equipment standing between that cylinder and your patient's airway. This is from cylinder pressure to patient flow. We're covering today how gas moves from the source all the way to the patient, what a regulator actually does, and how a single versus multi-stage regulator works. Preset and adjustable are different. Then we'll go into flow meters, the different types, the Thorpe tube, the burden gauge, and the flow restrictors, and how each can control or indicate the flow going to your patient. And then we'll connect every piece of this to real troubleshooting because the equipment doesn't always behave the way the textbook says it should. So let's start with the big picture. Every oxygen delivery system follows the same basic pathway. We go from a gas source to a regulator, to a flow meter, to the delivery device, and then to the patient. And that is the whole chain. And here's what matters when something goes wrong. It's going wrong at one of these four links. So let's set up an example and we'll come back to it later. So say you're transporting a patient and your oxygen source is a cylinder holding over 2000 psi. Before that gas does anything useful for your patient, it has to pass through a regulator, then a flow meter before it ever reaches a delivery device. So keep that in your head and we'll come back to it. Okay. This is where I'm going to slow down because students can get mixed up. With these two constantly. So a regulator and a flow meter do two completely different jobs and they're not interchangeable. Think about the water supply at home. A fire hydrant puts out water at a huge pressure. And you don't just go and hook your garden hose straight up to it because the hose will blow apart and you have no control over that flow. Something has to knock that pressure down first. And that's the regulator's job. It takes a huge cylinder pressure and reduces it down to what we call a working pressure. For oxygen in the United States, that's about 50 psi. Once pressure is down to something usable, you need a second piece of equipment to control or indicate how much gas actually moves toward the patient, how many liters per minute. And that's the flow meter's job. So say it with me. The regulator controls the pressure and it measures in PSI, and then the flow meter controls the flow and is measured in liters per minute. Different jobs, different units, and different pieces of equipment. So, and the regulator is not really optional. You skip it or let it fail and you risk sending pressure downstream that equipment was never built to handle. One more detail here is with a cylinder, you need a regulator attached before the flow meter. At a wall outlet, the gas is already regulated to around 50 psi. Your flow meter connects directly to it. No separate regulators needed. So now not every regulator drops the pressure the same way. Some do it in one move and some do it in steps. A single stage regulator brings cylinder pressure straight down to working pressure in a single step. Simple, and it works fine for everyday use. But then you have the multi stage regulator that does the same job in two or more smaller steps, something like 2,200 psi down to 700. Then the second stage would go down to 50. And why do we bother? Because a gradual pressure drop gives a steadier output than one big sudden drop. So separately, you'll hear the words preset and adjustable. Preset means one fixed outlet pressure. You don't touch it. It's already set. Adjustable means the operator dials in the outlet pressure they want. And on the multi-stage regulator, that first stage is always preset, but the final stage may be preset or adjustable. So don't confuse those ideas. The single stage versus multi-stage is about how many steps the pressure drops happens in. So preset versus adjustable is about whether you get a chance to change that output. Now we're going to our flow meters and we're starting with the one you'll see all the time and you've probably already laid hands on in clinical, and that's the Thorpe tube. So you can picture that there's right here in the slide, a clear tube, narrow at the bottom, a little wider as it goes up. The gas flow, the gas flows in and pushes a small float up inside. And the more the flow you dial in, the higher that float rises. So next to the tube is a calibrated scale in liters per minute, red where the float sits, and that's your flow. So there's one catch though. A Thorpe tube works correctly upright, but if it is tipped sideways and gravity isn't pulling on the float the same way, the reading becomes unreliable. So what if there's resistance downstream, like say a humidifier bottle attached after the flow meter, pushing back against that flow? That is called downstream resistance or back pressure. And a non-pressure compensated Thorpe tube, that needle valve sits upstream of that float, and the back pressure causes the float to underread. The dial says more flow than the patient's actually getting. So in a pressure compensated Thorpe tube, the needle valve sits downstream instead, so stays accurate even when there is back pressure. And that's why pressure compensated flow meters are preferred clinically attached with a humidifier, and you still want a flow meter that's telling you the truth. Now, here's a different type of flow meter, and that's called the Burdon gauge. And this is where some people may mix it up with the Thorpe tube. So pay attention to the contrast here. The Burdon gauge doesn't use a float at all. Gas passes through a fixed orifice and a reducing valve, and a needle moves to show flow calibrated in liters per minute. Because it doesn't depend on gravity pulling on the float, a Burdon gauge works in any position, sideways, upside down, it doesn't matter. That's exactly why it's the flow meter you often see used during transport, like that portable cylinder scenario from earlier. But there is a catch, and it's only accurate when the pressure on the patient side is essentially atmospheric. Back pressure downstream causes it to overestimate the flow, and that's the opposite problem from a non-compensated Thorpe tube, which underestimates the flow. Back pressure makes a Thorpe tube read low and a Burdon gauge read high. And we're going to briefly cover over the flow restrictor. And that's simply just where the gas passes through an orifice here on a fixed opening size to allow a specific flow. Preset models give you exactly one fixed flow. The adjustable models give you a handful of selectable options. And there's also another catch here, and this one matters clinically. A flow restrictor only delivers its labeled flow if it's getting the correct source pressure. So feed it the wrong pressure and the actual flow won't match what it's supposed to deliver. So if the patient's flow ever looks off with one of these, check the source pressure is one of the first things that I would consider. All right, so let's bring back that patient scenario. That cylinder holds over 2,000 PSI, right? Before it's safe or useful for a patient, it has to go through a regulator to bring it down to a working pressure. Then through a flow device, maybe a Burdon gauge, since it's holding up well during transport, before it finally reaches the delivery device your patient is breathing from. Now, here's that quick question for you. What component reduces pressure and which component determines the flow toward the patient? If you said the regulator reduces pressure and the flow meter controls flow, then you're on the right track. And that's the whole lesson today, that the regulator makes gas pressure usable and the flow meter controls or indicates the flow of the gas. And the delivery device determines how that flow finally reaches your patient. Get comfortable with that chain because you'll be diagnosing and using it directly. And we'll continue in the next video.